London 1964, the Beatles were the most famous people on earth. That sentence is not hyperbole. Beatlemania had swept the United States. 55,000 fans at Shea Stadium, crowds that made the ground shake, police escorts everywhere they went, teenage girls weeping at the sight of them, politicians seeking photo opportunities, royalty requesting meetings. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, they were untouchable gods of popular culture, adored with a ferocity that bordered on mass hysteria. And then someone mentioned Ella Fitzgerald was backstage at the same television studio. What happened next became one of the most quietly extraordinary moments in music history, not because of screaming crowds or historic concerts, but because four young men who had never been nervous about anything suddenly became very, very nervous. This is the story of the day the world's biggest band met the woman who helped create the world they inhabited, of Paul McCartney studying her recordings as a teenager to understand phrasing, of John Lennon saying she'd always been too good, almost frighteningly good, of Ella Fitzgerald treating four screaming girls idols as musical colleagues, nothing more, nothing less, and of what happens when genuine respect crosses generational lines. The meeting took place at a moment when two entirely different musical worlds were colliding in ways nobody had predicted. Ella Fitzgerald had been the dominant female voice in American music since the late 1930s. By 1964, she was 46 years old, had been recording for nearly 30 years, had won multiple Grammy Awards, had performed for heads of state, had been called the First Lady of Song by so many critics and musicians that the title had simply become her name. Her influence was everywhere, even in places that didn't look like jazz. Singers who came after her learned phrasing from her recordings. Producers studied how her voice interacted with orchestration. Musicians analyzed her improvisational techniques. Whether they knew it or not, nearly everyone making music in the 1950s and 1960s had been shaped by Ella Fitzgerald, including four young men from Liverpool. John Lennon had grown up in a household where his mother Julia played banjo and piano and sang. His Aunt Mimi kept a tidy house in Woolton where music filtered through constantly. From an early age, John absorbed whatever came over the radio, whatever his mother played, whatever filtered through the British entertainment landscape. American music, jazz, blues, early rock and roll, was the thing that felt alive to him, that felt like the future rather than the past. Ella Fitzgerald's recordings were part of that American musical education he was giving himself, even if he wouldn't have named her the way he'd named Chuck Berry or Little Richard. Paul McCartney's father Jim was a genuine jazz musician. He'd led Jim Mack's jazz band, played piano with real professional skill, exposed young Paul to the world of sophisticated popular music from childhood. Paul grew up understanding chords, arrangements, the relationship between melody and harmony in ways that most teenage singers didn't. He listened to American vocalists with musical ears, not just fan ears. He'd spent hours with Ella Fitzgerald's recordings, particularly the songbook albums, studying her phrasing, the way she would sit behind the beat on certain phrases and push ahead on others, creating tension and resolution that made a lyric feel inevitable even when it wasn't. Paul understood that Ella wasn't just singing notes, she was shaping time itself. George Harrison's musical tastes ran toward complexity and mastery. He was drawn to musicians who had genuine technical skill, who could do things others couldn't, who'd clearly worked for what they had. Ella Fitzgerald, with her perfect pitch, her ability to improvise brilliantly over any harmonic structure, her understanding of how a voice could function as both a melodic and rhythmic instrument, this represented exactly the kind of mastery George respected and aspired toward in his own way. Ringo Starr, the least musically theoretical of the four, simply loved Ella's voice the way millions of ordinary listeners did, because it was beautiful and made everything feel effortless and could move to emotion without quite knowing how it had done it. Ringo had good instincts about what was real, and Ella was real. By the time the Beatles arrived in America in February 1964 and appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show to an audience of 73 million Americans, they had already been carrying Ella Fitzgerald's musical influence for years without always explicitly naming it. They'd absorbed her sense of rhythm, her understanding that a song isn't just notes but the space between notes, that sometimes the most powerful moments are silence, letting a phrase breathe before coming back in. That phrasing, the way you approach a word, hold it, release it, could transform an ordinary melody into something unforgettable. These weren't jazz techniques anymore by 1964. They'd been absorbed into the general vocabulary of popular music, but they'd originated. Somewhere, and much of where they'd originated was Ella Fitzgerald. The specific meeting happened during a period when the Beatles were dominating both America and Britain, when their schedules were impossibly crowded, when they were surrounded at all times by managers, publicists, security, journalists, and the machinery of global celebrity. They were at a London television studio for a recording, one of many appearances they made during those relentless years of promotion. The studio was large and busy, various performers coming and going, technical crew everywhere. Someone from the production team, making conversation with Brian Epstein, the Beatles' manager, mentioned casually that Ella Fitzgerald had been in the studio earlier that day recording a television appearance and might still be in the building. Epstein relayed this to the Beatles. Reaction was immediate and completely contrary to how these four young men normally behaved. Paul McCartney, who was generally the most composed and socially confident Beatle, said, "Ella Fitzgerald, she's here, in this building. She might still be here," Epstein said. "Can we meet her?" This was unusual. The Beatles didn't typically ask to meet people. People asked to meet them. In 1964, the power dynamic was entirely reversed for virtually every other human on Earth. Prime ministers and movie stars wanted Beatle introductions. The boys themselves were famously unimpressed by celebrity, somewhat bored by it, occasionally contemptuous of the machinery that surrounded it. But Ella Fitzgerald was different. John Lennon, who was sitting nearby, said simply, "Yeah, find out if she'll meet us." The production assistant went to make inquiries. The Beatles waited, which was itself extraordinary. The Beatles didn't wait for people. People waited for the Beatles. Ella was in her dressing room, being prepared to leave for the evening when there was a knock at her door. Her manager answered, spoke with someone, then turned to Ella. "The Beatles are here. They'd like to meet you." Ella looked up from what she was doing. The Beatles, the singing group. Yes, apparently they're great admirers. Ella was 46 years old. The Beatles phenomenon had not entirely passed her by. It was impossible to be alive in 1964 and be unaware of Beatlemania, but it was not her world. She was aware of them the way she was aware of many popular acts. They were clearly talented, clearly doing something that connected with young audiences, but not the music she inhabited or particularly studied. "Well, if they'd like to say hello," Ella said, "they're welcome." A few minutes later, there was another knock. The door opened, and four young men filed into Ella Fitzgerald's dressing room. What happened next surprised everyone present, including the Beatles' own roadies and assistants who'd accompanied them. Paul McCartney, confident, charming, professionally social, shook Ella's hand and said, "Miss Fitzgerald, this is an honor. I grew up listening to your records." John Lennon, who famously said exactly what he thought and maintained an air of cool detachment from nearly everyone, said, "You're the reason half of what we do makes any sense, musically speaking." George Harrison, characteristically quieter but sincere, said, "Your phrasing, I've spent years trying to understand how you do it." Ringo Starr said, "Your voice is the most beautiful thing I've ever heard on a record. I mean that." Ella looked at them, these four young men who had screaming fans outside every venue they entered, who couldn't walk down a street in any country without causing riots, and she smiled the smile she saved for moments she genuinely found touching. "Sit down," she said. "Tell me what you've been up to." And that's when the real conversation began. Paul McCartney sat forward in his chair the way he had as a teenager watching his father's band, with that posture of genuine engagement that meant he was actually listening. He asked about the songbook recordings, which ones had been hardest to record, what was Cole Porter like as a lyricist compared to George Gershwin. Ella, genuinely pleased by the specificity of his knowledge, talked about the difference between Porter's wit and Gershwin's romanticism, about how each composer required a different emotional approach, about how Buddy Bregman's arrangements had allowed her to find things in those songs she hadn't known were there. Paul McCartney was taking notes mentally, she realized. This wasn't celebrity conversation. This was a musician asking another musician about craft. John Lennon asked about improvisation. He'd been fascinated by the idea of musical composition happening in real time. It connected to something he instinctively understood, the way the best moments in Beatles recordings were often the accidents, the unexpected choices, the things that happened because someone played something slightly wrong and it turned out to be exactly right. "How do you know what to sing when you're improvising?" he asked. "How do you know what the right note is?" Ella Thought about this, you don't know, she said. That's the point, you feel it. You've trained yourself to trust your musical instincts enough that when you open your mouth, you trust what comes out. But what if what comes out is wrong? If you commit to it fully, it's never wrong. It might not be what you planned, but nothing you commit to completely is wrong. The audience can feel commitment. They can feel hesitation too. John Lennon was quiet for a moment. Then that's the truest thing anyone said to me about music in a long time. George Harrison asked the question he'd actually wanted to ask since walking into the room. Your pitch, you never miss. In all your recordings, I've never heard you hit a wrong note. How? Ella smiled. I've hit plenty of wrong notes, ask my producers. Not on the recordings. On the recordings I was very focused. Also, Norman Granz wouldn't let me release anything where I'd been careless. He had very high standards. But even in concert recordings, you almost never miss. Training, Ella said simply. Years and years and years of training and listening. You have to listen to yourself with complete honesty, which is harder than it sounds. Most people can't bear to listen to themselves that critically. She didn't mention that she couldn't bear to listen to her own recordings at all. That was a vulnerability she kept private. Ringo, who had been quietly absorbing everything, said, "Can I ask something that might be cheeky?" "Go ahead. Do you like what we do? The Beatles' music, I mean. Do you think it's any good?" The room went slightly quiet. It was a disarmingly honest question. From someone who, in 1964, could have the adoration of virtually anyone on earth, but apparently wasn't sure he had Ella Fitzgerald's. Ella looked at him thoughtfully. "I think you're doing something I don't entirely understand, but that I can hear is real. There's something in how you boys work together, the way you listen to each other, that reminds me of the best jazz groups. You're not just playing the notes, you're playing the space between the notes." Ringo smiled. "That's the nicest thing anyone said about us who didn't scream it." Everyone in the room laughed, including Ella. The conversation continued for nearly 40 minutes, far longer than anyone had anticipated. Ella asked them about touring, about how they managed to keep playing together night after night with the same energy. She asked about their songwriting process. She'd heard some of their original compositions and was curious about how two people wrote together the way Lennon and McCartney did. Paul talked about the writing partnership, how he and John pushed against each other, how disagreement often produced better work than agreement, how one person's weakness became the other person's opportunity. Ella nodded slowly. "That's interesting. I've never had that kind of creative partnership. I've always worked with arrangers and producers, but the song itself usually came from somewhere else. I wonder sometimes what I would have written if I'd tried." "You would have been extraordinary," Paul said, and meant it without any trace of flattery. When the meeting finally ended, Ella's manager gently indicating she needed to leave for another engagement, the four Beatles stood up. There was a moment of slightly awkward formality. The social choreography of how you say goodbye to someone you've just realized is one of your genuine heroes. Paul McCartney shook her hand again and said, "Thank you, genuinely, this meant a lot." John Lennon, characteristically less conventional, said, "You're the real thing. Not many people are the real thing." George Harrison said quietly, "I'm going to go listen to the songbook albums again tonight." Ella watched them leave. Then she turned to her manager and said, "Nice boys. Serious about music, more than people give them credit for." They were completely starstruck, her manager said, amused. The Beatles were starstruck. Ella looked slightly puzzled by this. Were they? They seemed like musicians talking about music. Ella, they were nervous. They asked permission to meet you. The Beatles don't ask permission for anything. Ella considered this and then smiled, that particular smile she had when something genuinely pleased her. "Well, that's very kind of them." In interviews across the years, Paul McCartney consistently spoke about vocalists who had shaped his understanding of singing. Ella's name appeared in those conversations more than casual observers might have expected. Paul talked about her phrasing, about how she'd made him understand that singing wasn't just hitting the right notes but inhabiting the space around them. John Lennon, in the more philosophical interviews he gave in the late 1960s and early 1970s, talked about what separated genuine artistic expression from commercial product. When he reached for examples of artists he considered truly authentic, jazz vocalists appeared. Ella Fitzgerald represented something for John, proof that you could be commercially enormous without compromising the thing that made you real. For Ella's part, she watched the Beatles' evolution with genuine attention. Their later albums struck her as something remarkable, serious attempts to expand what was possible in popular music. She didn't fully inhabit their world, but she respected the seriousness of the attempt. The 40 minutes in that London dressing room never became a famous story. It was a private meeting between musicians, known mainly to those present, but its significance lived in the music rather than in the telling, in the ways Paul McCartney's vocal phrasing continued showing roots deeper than rock and roll, in the ways John Lennon talked about authenticity, in the ways Ella's curiosity about musical development never stopped. Two different worlds, two different eras, two different vocabularies for describing what music could do and be, but at the center the same understanding, that music made with genuine intention, with real commitment, with honest emotion, that music reached people in ways that couldn't be manufactured or faked. Ella Fitzgerald had known this since 1934. The Beatles had figured it out by 1964. For 40 minutes in a London dressing room, both sides recognized each other as fellow travelers. The world's most famous band got starstruck. The most acclaimed singer of her generation was simply pleased to talk to serious young musicians who wanted to understand their craft. That's what the meeting was, underneath all the mythology, musicians talking to musicians. The screaming crowds were outside. In that dressing room there was only music.